I think everyone can agree with me that things are really evolving during this Hearthstone metagame. So let's go ahead and just jump right into the deck so that way my pun can make sense. But as it turns out, Evolve Shaman is definitely the best deck by far, but I have to apologize about my previous video because I did not highlight the best 30 card list. I somehow forgot how good Carving Chisel is in this deck, and the reason why we played Carving Chisel is so that way we can get value out of our Shadow Hunter Vol'jin as quickly as possible, so that way we can enable Thaddius combos, we can cheat out a Neptulon, but that's not even the real power of this deck. The real power of this deck is because of Blazing Transformation. Like, let's just be honest, this card is absolutely the Giga Nuts, and even though there is a glitch of being able to evolve into Colossal minions with this card, this is not the reason why the card is busted, albeit it is very frustrating. But one thing that I definitely have to say about this is that Evolve Shaman is now peaking at the top of the ladder right now. I think it's like 58% or something on HS Replay, and this is definitely going to be the deck that needs to be hit with some nerfs if this trend continues, but I would argue that it's now reached the point where you could argue that bumping this card up to 2 mana is probably the safest thing to do, because, I mean, being able to transform your own minion is already insanely powerful, but being able to transform an enemy minion is also insanely good because you just have that versatility, plus you have, you know, the synergy with Goldshire Null, which is, I believe, on its way out. So maybe that's a reason why they're not gonna nerf this, is just because they're gonna let this ride out for a little bit. But I believe that Evolve Shaman's win rate is starting to get to the point where it's becoming just a little bit problematic. And if it continues to reach like 60% on HS Replay, for example, something might need to be done about this deck because it is just obscenely broken right now. It is definitely the best deck in the game. And if Evolve Shaman was not the best deck in the game, it would definitely be Unholy Death Knight. I mean, there's not really much else to say about this deck other than Construct Quarter gave Death Knight an insane tool to where now we can run, you know, Egg in almost every single aggressive Death Knight deck. And I'll just give you guys a hint. Like, this card goes in every single Death Knight deck. Like, you know what I'm gonna do? I am so confident about this card that I'm gonna upgrade both of my copies to Golden. RIP my dust, right? But this card is just so good that I just literally crafted it Golden in front of you guys in order to prove a message. So I want this message to be received loud and clear. This is one of the best cards in Death Knight, and you can run it in every single version, and you will see lists coming up ahead that do run this card. But Unholy Death Knight is still really good right now because of I mean, it's the best board-based deck right now. Necromancer is insane. Blightfang gives you comeback ability. Your 1-drops are even more insane now that you have this location. Again, this location is huge. Now you're not as dependent on like Hawkstrider on turn 3, for example, or coining this out because now you have the location. Like, this deck has now like a lot more versatility because of this 4/5 with Rush. It's almost like, the best way that I can describe it is like what Wild Palm Null used to be, you know? Like, if you play a 4/5 with Rush by turn 2, you just win the game. So don't even get me started on how OP Foul Egg and Decoying Construct Quarter is. It literally feels like old style Miracle Rogue where they just threw down a Wild Palm Null against you. So whenever you want to think about this card being good or bad, just think about, how good was Wild Palm Null? It was pretty freaking good. Next up is an aggro deck that I believe is taking Hearthstone by storm, and I actually didn't say this in the video, but I'm going to go through my top 5 best decks, then I'm going to go through 5 other decks so you can play in Standard, and then I'm going to introduce 5 meme decks so you can definitely have some fun with. But in any case, this is definitely one of my top 5 decks right now because it just seems to be getting better and better, and every single time I go up against this deck, like, I'm realizing just how insanely powerful some of these swing turns can be, and honestly, like, this Rotting Necromancer, being an undead and having synergy with your undead minions and essentially having a Mind Blast on top of it, that's a good card. And then you just slap a 5/4 body. Like, they really wanted to support this archetype, and I wonder if this card was originally a format of 5/5. Like, I don't know, man. Hearthstone cards seem to be all over the place in terms of like their stat lines nowadays. But in any case, I think that this deck is actually pretty legit, and I believe I think it's Denim Blue. I'll put his tweet up here just so that way I'm giving credit to the right person because I can't recall whose tweet I saw. But they are top 25 with Aggro Priest, and I believe they've been mainly playing this deck since the mini set came out. So that is somebody that has been climbing primarily with this deck and probably went through the phases of getting out the bad cards and putting in the good cards, because I really haven't seen that many lists only running one Haunting Nightmare. So I'm kind of intrigued by that inclusion, but in any case, I do believe that Undead Aggro Priest does have some potential due to the fact that it is just an aggro deck right now, and aggro decks seem to be performing extremely well due to the fact that games are ending on an average of like turns 6 through 8, Which is why some in some of these decks coming up ahead, you'll see like these insane combo decks. But in any case, this is just a really solid aggro deck, and it's finally time for the aggro priest mains to rise up. Next up is yet another Death Knight deck, because Death Knight is still insanely good, and again, it's just kind of talking about how good Construct Quarter is as a card. This card is just really, like, carrying the early game of Death Knight to where its late game is already super insane, because we already know how good Frostworm Fury is, but now we just get to that, you know, that phase more often, which is why this card is insanely good, and why we can run cards like Acolyte of Death now. We have Foul Egg, we have Skeletal Sidekick. Like, this almost looks like Unholy Death Knight, until you realize that we have Bonebreaker, we have Horn, and then we have the Triple Frost cards in order to make this deck into, like, a mid-range deck. It's really just it's an anti-deck. And by an anti-deck, I mean that it's a deck that is just trying to make things as awkward as possible for your opponent. So you have early game for the decks that don't like the idea of decks going wide. You have easy removal as well as tons of synergy in order to actively cycle through your deck. We obviously know how good, you know, School Teacher and Frostworm Furies are, so I don't have to tell you about that. Overseer for Jara, forget about it, man. Like, this deck just feels extremely tight, and I love that Acolyte of Death is now a card that we can play, since if we have the location on the field on turn 3, then we can play Foul Egg into Death Knight, or I'm sorry, Acolyte of Death on 4, and then we automatically get the value. We get a 4/5. Like, that's an insane amount of swing, and that's exactly what this deck wants to do. Is that, you know, you play, for example, you play your Bonebreaker on 1, you can Harbinger on 2, you can Construct Quarter on 3, and even if they don't kill the Harbinger, you still have that play that I just talked about with Egg into Death. So this deck really does have these insane 1, 2, 3, 4 plays, and then when you follow it up with the potential of Frostworm Fury, like, it's just game over at that point. You don't even need Death Whisper at that point, and that does really make me sad, because Death Whisper is one of my favorite cards in the Death Knight class, but unfortunately, she's just too slow. There's not, you know, there's really not a reason to run her right now, because this deck is just super good, and I love the idea of calling it Cold Breakfast. So if you do play this deck, please call it Cold Breakfast. And the last good deck that I'm going to feature in my top 5 is definitely going to be Phylactery Warlock, and the reason why I'm showcasing this list is because if aggro decks are going to be on the rise, then the decks that counter aggro are going to be on the rise, and one deck in particular I really wanted to squeeze in top 5 because I'm seeing a lot of prominent players doing well with this deck. But unfortunately, I gotta give it to Phylactery. It's a little bit of bias, I have to admit, because I know how to play this deck, and I know how insane it can be. But Phylactery is just one of those decks to where you master it, and you feel like a Hearthstone god, because if the deck gives you everything that you need, then you're absolutely fine with losing against, like, the Evolve Shaman that finds Thaddius every now and again. Because you can't deal with a turn 4 scam. Like, I'll just be up front. You're gonna have to lose those games, and this deck is gonna be kind of awkward into Evolve Shaman because of that reason. But in every other situation, you are going to do what Warlock does best by playing Rod on 5, discounting your cards, and then somehow winning the games by turn. Honestly, you win by 6 if you're lucky enough, but getting the combo by turn 7, turn 8 is what's usually gonna happen. If you don't know how to play this deck, I do have tons of clips of this deck on the channel, so go ahead and check out the video that talks about Phylactery, as well as this kind of joke video where we do play Phylactery, but with every single other Death Rattle card. So we had a lot of fun with that video, so those links will be down below. But in any case, Phylactery is still super insane right now, and if aggro keeps becoming more popular, this is a great deck to try and counter those aggro decks. Just watch out for Evolve Shamans. And now we're going to talk about my top 5 decks that you can play in order to still do well in Hearthstone, but aren't like the meta decks that everyone is playing right now. And I gave a highlight to this deck actually last night, because I really do believe that Blood DK has some potential, but there's a couple of problems with it. One, most Hearthstone players don't like playing games that are above 20, 25, 30, 35 minutes. And sometimes that can kind of happen with this deck, especially if you get in the Blood DK mirror. That is not something that a lot of players have the patience or the brain power for, unfortunately, because playing 35-minute game of Hearthstone, like, without a deck tracker, like, being able to remember everything is just freaking ridiculous at that point. Which is why you should download Deck Tracker, link down below. Good plug, right? But in any case, this deck is still insanely good because it's exactly what, you know, a lot of aggro decks are scared of. They're scared of the Blood Boil. They're scared of 4/5s with Rush. Again, this card is super good. They're scared of, you know, decks with 50, 60, 70 life at times. And then you have Patchwork and Brand combos, you know, in case you have to go to the late game and you need to deny an opponent. Like, I actually did this against an Evolve Shaman, and this deck is actually surprisingly good against Evolve Shaman because you run cards like Obliterate, you have cards like Corpse Explosion, you have plenty of ways of being able to deal with those ridiculous boards that Shamans can play, and this is also really good into Unholy Death Knight as long as you get your Blood Boils. So this is beating the best 2 decks right now, and I don't get why more people aren't talking about this, because it beats the best 2 decks right now. So I don't know exactly like what meta-relevant deck is an absolute counter to this, because we do have cards like Rivendare War Rider, for example. Like, we're probably going to lose to other Horsemen decks if they pop off the combo faster than us. But again, Patchwork kind of like acts as this way of enabling this deck to be the anti-Horseman deck, especially when you pair it with Bran, especially if you find another copy with Hematurge. Like, there's just a lot of potential for Blood DK. It's just people don't want to play it because it takes too long, and there are times to where you make one mistake and it does kind of throw away the game. Case in point with Obliterate, like, you don't just want to throw away this card on something that's not a 10-mana card in the Shaman matchup, and you really want to save this card to where it's extremely important to get that swing back in your favor. So I want to endorse Blood DK as one of the best decks in Hearthstone right now, but I can't give it my top 5 because the stats just don't back it up. But my heart is believing in Blood DK for one of the first times in a long time. And with continuing with the idea that you can counter aggro, Quest Priest is actually making an amazing comeback. And you also have cards like Plague Spreader in order to deny the OTK cards that your opponent might be playing if they are playing a if they're playing a control deck that is trying to go to the late stages of the game. So you also have Theatar. You have lots of ways of being able to deny, you know, the goofy decks that you'll see on ladder. This is just the anti-fun killer, and it always makes me sad in order to recommend Quest Priest. But some players are also doing well with Priest in general right now, as like the counter to what you'll be seeing on the ladder. So maybe there's some hope for Priest in this expansion as like the counter decks of the expansion. But I mean, again, Undead Priest still seems like a meta running, or a front runner of the meta deck that a lot of people should be playing. And this deck, I don't know how good it is against it, but it's still just, you know, a good anti-aggro deck. And it's Quest Priest. I don't think I'm going to spend too much time explaining it because everyone kind of understands how this deck works. You just make your opponent want to concede the game. That's always been the Priest philosophy, and man, does this deck definitely follow by those standards. The next 3 decks that I'm going to show you that are going to kind of fill out my top 10 best decks of the meta are just going to be decks that you've already seen. So unfortunately, Miracle Rogue is still really good right now, and I believe the Meat Man has been climbing in top 10 legend with this deck. Not exclusively, but it's been his primary way of being able to gain ranks. And I believe at first they were just kind of testing the waters to see what they could get away with, to see if playing something other than Miracle Rogue was possible, which it definitely is possible at that high legend rank. But still, Miracle Rogue is a deck that is not gonna die until some kind of rotation happens. And I think Mailbox Dancer is on that list of cards that will rotate out. So we're not gonna really see that many really big Draka weapons if you know, we don't get another card that gives us coin as a battle cry that works with Shadow Step so well. I don't think we need to nerf Shadow Step, and in the deck, one of the decks coming up ahead, there may be an argument for people being like, oh, we need to nerf Shadow Step, but I'll give you a spoiler right now. That deck is not broken. It really isn't, so nerfing Shadow Step for the sake of that deck is kind of going a bit too far. But Miracle Rogue is still insanely good right now, followed by these other 2 decks that you've probably already seen. Aggro Mage really didn't change all too much, and in all honesty, this deck still seems super close to what Ping Mage is right now, so I'm going to go ahead and recommend both. So let me go ahead and transition to the other deck in order to talk about both of them at the same time. Because just like that, you just made a control version of this deck, and it's not, I mean, it looks super similar, but the key cards are there. You summon skeletons, you only have the freaking hero card in order to make your hero power into what you want your big, spell damage turns to be, you know, with Frozen Touch and whatnot. But in any case, both of these decks are still super good, but I'm deciding to combine both of them because there's still one other deck that I want to showcase that has one new card in it, but it's still the same deck. But if you're a big mage, player, then these decks are definitely super good. Big Spell Mage doesn't make the cut, unfortunately, because it's way too dependent on its scam, and even then, sometimes the scam isn't good enough if your rune fails. It's just, unfortunately, Big Spell Mage is super dependent on Sorcerer, or on Barbaric Sorcerer getting the value, so that way you can make your cards from your opponent worse, but that is just not really the archetype that you should be playing right now. I would highly recommend these other mage decks. And then the last quote-unquote good deck that I will showcase is Imp Warlock, and I believe this actually makes 11 decks instead of 10, so you're welcome. But in any case, apparently the new card, Nothing's Impossible. I love puns, but this I want to say that I'm angry at it, but at the same time, I can't say that I'm angry at it because it's well played, Hearthstone. That's just all I'm gonna say about this card. Well played. But in any case, it does kind of help out with this this deck's weakness of not being able to produce sticky boards. And you're like, wow, Clark, how can you say that Warlock doesn't really have sticky boards right now? Well, the only way that they really made sticky boards was because of the location. You made a really big minion, and the only like kind of sticky card was your Imp Gang boss that would summon more minions depending on what your opponent did. Now you actually have a way of being able to set up like an insane like 1-2 curve into like another 1-drop into Nothing's Impossible, and even if your opponent does have the AoE, suddenly you have, you know, like cards like Shady Bartender, or you have cards like Mischievous Imp ready to go to get a bunch of value that absolutely lock out your opponent. So you want to try and set up this card with these other cards in mind if at all possible, but you also just want to be able to use this as a tool to play around your opponent's AoE, which is something that Imp Block really did not have access to, and why a lot of people went with the Curse build. Is the Curse build still good? Of course it is. It's Imp Curse Warlock. Which one is better? It's kind of hard to say. This deck is the one that probably beats the decks that are like weak against like, you know, all-in aggro, like a Druid deck, for example. But I mean, I would say that Curse Imp Block is just probably better against decks that go back and forth a bit more consistently, and most of the time aren't trying to kill you until turns like 8 through 10. So maybe, you know, take that with a grain of salt. I think this deck is just better because it's running the new card right now, and I think it gives this deck an avenue that it didn't have before, unlike Curse Warlock, which is still doing the same thing. But both decks are around the same power level. It's just about which matchups you want to be better against. And now we're going to talk about the fun decks that unfortunately don't make the top 10 cut, because unfortunately, Big Warlock is just, it's an archetype that is super dependent on being able to cheat mana with either Vandar Stormpike, and honestly, this card isn't even the real MVP of the deck. The real MVP is the Slime. If you play this card on turn 4, turn 5, you actually have a legitimate way of winning the game, because if your opponent clears, you can get cards like Flesh Behemoth, and then you have, you know, Shallow Grave in order to high roll with these cards even more. But the real power of this deck, and I'm putting power in quotes here, is Rivendare Warrider. One thing that you can potentially do, and this is a very this is like a Christmas land situation to where you kind of have to have the perfect situation happen. But you discard, you kill off the Horsemen, and then you can play like Slime. You play Shallow Grave into like the Slime, and it pulls like Flesh Behemoths. And then if you want to hit a Flesh Behemoth with a Shallow Grave, then you'd start drawing the Horsemen from your deck. And I just think that's, you know, and then it actually gets summoned onto the field automatically. So like that's kind of the idea with this deck, is that you're trying to like set up this weird OTK when it's possible. It's not like the main theme of the deck, but it is a win condition of the deck to where you can, you know, end these games automatically. And I have seen this popped off as early as turn 9, I think. It was either turn 8 or turn 9, but like, my god, when it happened, it was super insane. But unfortunately, that is just not how this deck performs usually. This deck is very dependent on its early game with cards like Plague Eruption to clear early game. And honestly, I believe you really want to run a 2-of in this deck, but this is the list that Tice came up with, so I'm just going to keep it as is. You have Dark Alley Pact in order to make a big minion in case you don't have your Slime turn. But since this card doesn't really have Taunt, it's just a vanilla minion that often gets killed. I hate to say it. But I mean, summoning an 8/8 for 4 mana is still pretty good in a lot of matchups. Havia's Corpse is actually really good in order to bring back your Slimes, to bring back your Behemoths, but it's more of a win more card, so this card is about as good as it's going to be in this list. Other than that, you have Control Warlock tools, and one card that I would actually love to somehow see fit in this deck is actually Entitled Customer. But the reason why this card probably doesn't see too much play in the deck, actually wait, it's not an Undead minion. Never mind. So this is definitely a good card to run the deck. It doesn't have any anti-synergy, I don't believe, unless is your Slime? Okay, Slimes also discard Undead minions. I don't even realize all the cards' effects in this deck, unfortunately. But Entitled Customer might be worth running as, like, you know, a way of being able to clear the board. But this is the best version of the deck that I've had success with. But in any case, if you want to try and fit in an Entitled Customer, it might be worth it. But try this deck out as is and then make some tech decisions based around it, because depending on where you are in the Hearthstone ladder, this deck might be surprisingly effective. Just always try to mulligan for the Slime because it's just the best card in this deck. Next up is Rainbow Death Knights, and I hate to say that this deck is just not really good, and the reason why I'm showcasing this deck is because of Frost Queen Sindragosa, but this card just, it doesn't really help Death Knight right now. Like, compare this to the location that literally sees play in every single Death Knight archetype. Like, the reason why this card is good, and I've said this in a previous video, is that Construct Quarter, Death Knights like to kill their minions, and they like to summon minions with Rush. That's great. This fits in almost every single archetype because every single Death Knight likes that in their deck. Unfortunately, I believe that Frost Queen Sindragosa would be insane in a deck like Blood DK. Kind of hard to see the requirement right here, but there's that little requirement. You need a Blood and a Frost card. But in any case, like, Frost decks really do not care about this effect, you know? Like, it is a comeback tool, but it just doesn't make that much sense in this metagame right now because, unfortunately, Shamans are doing a lot way before this card is ever going to come out. And this card is really good as a discover, but being able to tech your entire deck this way in order to slot it into the deck just doesn't make a lot of sense because in the Rainbow archetype, at least, you have, like, this pseudo Unholy Death Knight style of deck, but you still have, like, other ways of being able to scam the game with, like, No Muncher, with Patchwork. You have Blightfang combos in order to pull things around, Acolyte of Death, as well as Bonebreaker. And I've even gone so far to put in an Obliterate. This is a deck that I made myself, by the way. I did not take this from any website. But I put in Obliterate in order to somehow deal with Shamans, and I think that maybe, just maybe, we take out the we take out the Sindragosa and we put in a second Obliterate. Because it really doesn't make that much of a difference, man. Like, I want to run the Queen, and it's, like, part of the reason why I made this deck, you know? Because I wanted, first of all, Rainbow DK to have, like, an actual deck. Second of all, I wanted to play the Frost Queen, but so far this card has just not been performing. And if you want to play Rainbow, it might just be correct to cut it out. But, I mean, I can't really speak for sure yet because I need more data to back this up. And if I get more games in order to show how good Queen is, then I'll make a video about it. Till then, I don't believe in the card right now. Next up is probably the coolest way to play the new legendary Rivendare War Rider, and this is probably going to be one of my next videos that I post after I make a video about the Unholy Death Knight, just because it's the best deck right now. Or one of the best decks, I should say. Evolve Shaman is still a hell of a deck, but this deck is kind of weak against Evolve Shaman, but against everything else, dude, like, this actually does have a lot of potential to be, like, a legitimate deck if things get nerfed for Shaman, actually. Like, the thing I really like about this deck, and the thing I'm actually not 100% sold on, is that the 3 minions that you run are Vandar, the Horsemen, and the Death Speaker Blackhorn. And the idea is that with Scythe, you can get 3 copies of your Horseman, essentially, and then when the Horseman dies, you have no minions in the deck, and then you have Proving Grounds ready to go in order to pull those minions from deck. And you still have cards like Deal with the Devil and plenty of other Relic spells in order to, you know, maintain a sense of board control and, you know, just actually having minions on the field to interact with, so that way you can stall for your combo. But the one thing I really don't know about this deck is actually the inclusion of Death Speaker Blackhorn, actually. Because the idea is you would need to draw every single soul, you would need to kill off the War Rider, then you play Vandar into Death Speaker Blackhorn in order to pull them from your deck, which does sound amazing, but that's an 11 mana combo. You need to do this over the course of like 3 turns, so you need to set up, kill the War Rider, then play Vandar, do something else, and then play Death Speaker Blackhorn, because you're not going to be able to discount these cards because you're not drawing them with the Relic of Dimensions, which is why some people have opted to not play the Scythe, but I think the Scythe version is just so good with Proving Grounds in particular. I think this is a really fun deck, but if you want my opinion, I think that the Death Speaker Blackthorn is actually bait, and there's actually maybe a reason to run a card like Zymox instead, so that way you're sticking more to the Relic side of the deck. But I think that is also kind of bait because it's also an 8 mana card that you would have to play for 9 mana, you know, unless you get lucky and make the soul 0 mana. But in any case, I think that Relic Horseman actually has a lot of potential. It's just about finding that perfect 30, but this was the best deck that I had success with, and I actually popped off the combo as early as turn 8. So this deck is actually not as bad as you may think. I'm not going to spend too long talking about this because it's pretty much Evolve Shaman, but I will highlight that this is the best way to play big Evolve Shaman. Look at all these big mana cards. Look at that curves. 10 7 mana or more cards in this deck with Glug, Alakir, Blightblood Berserker, Brakan, Criminal Lineup, and Overlord Drakuru. I absolutely love this card, and I can't believe we didn't find a way to put in the Neptulon just to make this as big as possible. But you do have Bone Lord Frostwhisper, so, you know, you kind of have something in this deck. And instead of having the Neptulon, I think it's just going all in on, like, Alakir into Criminal Lineup combos. Is this deck a meta breaker? I don't believe so, but Big Shaman is really fun right now, and since Evolve Shaman is the best deck in the game right now, you still have the games to where you just do the usual Evolve Shaman thing. But the reason why I like this deck is because if you play Thaddius and you still have 1 mana left over, or if you evolve into Thaddius, I mean, you can play Overlord Drakuru, or you can play Glug immediately because they'll cost 1 mana. Or you could even do something with like Shadowhunter Vol'jin in order to bring out a card from your deck if you have a minion on board. Point is, this deck is really fun. It's the most fun way to play Evolve Shaman because you have bigger cards, but your win rate is going to suffer just a little bit. And the last meta-breaking deck I'm going to show you guys is a combo that's probably already happened to you. It is Thaddius Rogue, and the reason why I'm putting it in this video is to tell you that this deck is actually not a meta breaker. Unfortunately, this deck is goofy, and it does have a quote-unquote consistent way of killing by turn 6, but if you don't kill by turn 6, you are actually going to die on average, because then the only way you can set up the combo is by turn 8. So, unfortunately, this deck is super dependent on drawing every single card by turn 5, and then having Bone Lord Frostwhisper die on turn 5, thanks to the Shadow Shambler. Now, I will admit, this deck is definitely, like, the most Omega Brain deck that I believe that we've seen, and you could actually make an argument that you can maybe cut a Door of Shadows for a Silverleaf Poison, just to try and make the deck a little bit more consistent. But in any case, I still do believe that this deck is just not there because according to HS Replay, it's barely got like a 45% win rate or something like that globally. It's sitting at the bottom at tier 4, and unfortunately, like it doesn't do anything else. Like, think about every other Rogue deck that is tier 1 right now. There's Thief Rogue, there's Miracle Rogue. Yes, Thief Rogue is still good, but I didn't want to put it in this video. But those decks are good right now because they have multiple win conditions. This deck doesn't have multiple win conditions, but believe me when I say that when you pop off the combo, it does feel like the best deck in the game. So if you want to try and challenge yourself in order to always hit this combo by turn 6, then I'm going to suggest this deck. But if you're trying to grind the ladder with it and get legend with this deck, it's not going to go well for you. I'm sorry. And the last deck that I'm going to showcase is a deck I could not recommend for anybody to play, but I just wanted to give a spoiler to a new video coming out in the next couple of days, and that is Frontline Paladin. Oh my god, this deck is not good. The only way that I was able to get a win with this deck was queuing into 2 Control Warriors, which goes to show you how bad Control Warrior is right now to where I can win with this deck. But just to give you guys a little bit of a hint on why I made this deck, we got challenged to do this on my Twitch stream over at twitch.tv/ClarkHellScream. Make sure you check that out. But the reason why I decided on this list is because we needed the perfect list, or we needed the perfect mix of minions and spells, so that way when Frontlines gets played, I'm not dependent on having a board that's absolutely wiped out, because, I mean, if your opponent has minions on the field, then suddenly this doesn't work as well. But the idea of the deck is to kill the War Rider and then use Frontlines in order to bring those minions out to the field, but the weakness is that it just summons it. They don't attack immediately, you know? Like, this card is just a card that, you know, brings out the minions, but then your opponent has to be the one to solve it. So it's very dependent on, like, this idea of playing, like, Cariel by turn 8 in order to survive, then play Frontlines on turn 9, and then somehow using a Wild Pyromancer Equality Clear in order to kill the Horsemen. It is not ideal, but I wanted to showcase how fun of an idea this deck was because I felt like a genius popping off this combo. But man, if this is a deck that I definitely would never recommend to anybody unless you want to do something gimmicky against your friends. But trust me, the video on this is going to be kind of funny because unfortunately Warrior is just giga unplayable with these kind of legendaries roaming around right now. But there you guys have it. Those are the best decks to climb the legend with in order to counter the legend ladder, as well as to have some fun in case you want to just play against your friends. So you're always going to find everything that you need on this channel, so make sure that you like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel in case you do enjoy this kind of content. And I just want to personally thank everybody that is currently seeing this right now, because not everybody makes it to the end of the video. So if you did watch all the way into the end, you are one of my, I love you. I'm just going to say that. I love you because not a lot of people are going to make it to this, so I can say I love you and actually mean it because I don't really know where I'm going with this. I just wanted to say thank you, and I wanted to do it in a fun way. So thank you for making it to the end of this video, and we'll see you for the next one.